Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Will Davies, who is at Goldsmiths University of London and teaches politics, and also is the author of a number of books. Have some with me. There is this one, Nervous States, Democracy and the Decline of Reason. And this one was preceded by the one called The Happiness Industry. And this one came out, I think, in 2015. That's when I launched a course on workplace and wellness. And so everything in this book was right on point for me when I started teaching that course. And then a more recent book is called This Is Not Normal, The Collapse of Liberal Britain. You had an older book called The Limits of Neoliberalism. And this one that you wrote sort of, I guess, during the pandemic or co-authored called Unprecedented, How COVID-19 Revealed the Politics of Our Economy. Welcome, Will.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, look, these books cover a lot of ground at the intersection of politics, psychology, science, sociology, and if I were to point out some of the major themes, I mean, one of the themes is that we are undergoing something of a crisis. I mean, it's an ongoing crisis, but one that really kind of came to a head at the time when you wrote this book, Nervous States. And a lot of people have been trying to figure out exactly what the heck is going on. And it seems like the people who are seen as the elites are ill-equipped to understand what is going on. And that involves questioning or a skepticism around the project, which began in the 17th century, the project of objectivity and of science and of, I guess, domestic peace. And I guess the first question I'd ask you, and this sort of also comes up in the happiness industry, why is it that people who are at the cutting edge of science, who understand psychology and economics and sociology and anthropology and all the rest of it, why are they so ill-equipped? I mean, isn't this what they study all day, every day? I mean, aren't we supposed to, as academics, be scrutinizing the sentiment of people and the way in which they think and behave and operate? Why should we be surprised by widespread human phenomenon?
Yeah. I mean, and you could also, another example of that would be which I think is so important for the world that we inhabit all these years later, would be the global financial crisis, where in some ways that was a crisis caused not by an absence of social science, but almost by too much social science. There was the hubris of economists who worked for banks, worked for government regulators, worked in university academic economics departments, that their models told them that everything was fine. And then it turned out that they were very far from fine. And equally, I suppose, there's been similar questions raised about polling, particularly since the 2016 US presidential election, but also the Brexit referendum in the UK. What were political scientists doing in the build up to 2016? Same question as what were economists doing in the build up to 2008? I think the answer to your question is that the social sciences are an enlightenment project to try to cast light on human societies, human behavior, markets, and so on. And that's something that I think needs to be defended and well funded and supported and so on. I think one of the difficulties which all social sciences have is that they, first of all, they are disciplines. They separate themselves off from one another, and that's partly because they're always on the hunt for institutional recognition and funding, and they want to be each one wants to be the kind of master social science. So economics, particularly in the hands of the Chicago School of Economics, which is something that I've been quite interested in. I talk about quite a lot in The Limits of Neoliberalism and to some extent in the happiness industry, but believe that economics could almost sort of do the job of all of the social sciences. And that's a very kind of arrogant, hubristic view of any social science. It's not that I think that sociology or political science should sort of be the master one instead. But equally, some of my interest in psychology stems from there being key moments in the development of modern psychology, particularly with behaviorism, again, an American tradition which put huge emphasis on statistics and the predictability of human action, that believed that that social science could sort of almost replace the need for political debate, for sort of deliberative policy making, because the mysteries of human activities were going to be sort of solved. And that the mistake at the heart of all of this is to treat the social sciences in the same way as if, that the Newtonian mechanics, the whole way back, even earlier than the 17th century and the scientific revolution, that we can do for human societies what natural philosophers and kind of rationalists have done for nature. And that, of course, is a terrible mistake, which many of the greatest social scientists, including some great right-wing economists like Friedrich Hayek, have been very, very critical of that project. But I think that's something that is one of the reasons why we get constantly caught unawares, and all these questions then get asked about, who were we listening to and what kind of evidence were we using?
Well, I mean, in the happiness industry, you talk about how, well, part of the story is about how economics took a greater interest in what the sources of what they call utility are and where they come from and how they manifest themselves. And this rise of behavioral economics, one would think that that should result in a more nuanced understanding of humanity, right? So economics, when it was limited to just money, right, it was a very partial view of humanity. And so expanding the scope of inquiry into these other domains, why wouldn't that make economics sort of both more realistic and more useful?
Well, I think the answer is that it does. I mean, I think it does make it more realistic in the sense that it starts with real world problems, such as, why do people not invest in personal pension schemes when actually, if you you start putting money into your pension fund age 25, you're going to have like a retirement where you're going to be sort of, twice as rich than if you start age 35 or something. I mean, I'm making these numbers up. There's issues to do with kind of, rationality that it seems odd that, or why do people smoke? There are all sorts of things that people do that seem to be utility diminishing. So in that sense, it does begin with real problems, and in some respects, it is more useful. But the question is always sort of useful to whom? And I think that part of the project of behavioral economics, which lends certain forms of behavioral psychology and certain forms of experimental psychology to the purposes of economics, in some ways turns economics into a wider project of control. And I think that a lot of the way in which behavioral economics, the promise of behavioral economics is to bring what appear to be irrational decisions within the scope of economic analysis and calculation and statistics. And in a way, this is I think it's interesting, and maybe not a coincidence that the sudden, I mean, behavioral economics begins in the 1970s with the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, which they later won the Nobel Prize for. And they were interested in, why is it that people are more worried about losses than they are about gains, where economics suggests that these things should carry equal weight as long if the quantities are the same. People bank gains and think, well, that's the end of that. And whereas with losses, it leaves a scar. And I think this is quite interesting. But it tends, what became of behavioral economics in the 21st century cropped up. It massively expanded around about the same time as the birth of what we might call platform capitalism, which was the big tech revolution of sort of 2005-6 onwards, that kind of time. And I think that the point is, the reason I raise that is that behavioral economics is in some ways a kind of something that becomes possible when the scope of data that is available is expanded. And one of the reasons why behavioral economics would have been a sort of a minor kind of pursuit of a few kind of lab experimenters back in the 80s, whereas now, in a way, it's the logic of how does Facebook know what to show me with quite such amazing detail and accuracy? Well, it is in some ways, I'm not saying it's literally picking up the work of Kahneman and Tversky, but it's operating within a similar epistemology and methodology, which is to say there is no form of behavior so irrational that it can't become predictable in some way. And that, I think, is in keeping with the wider project. And that's, I guess, I mean, look, I'm a sociologist that was kind of raised on sort of Frankfurt School and Foucault and this kind of stuff. So I'm interested in sort of some of the kind of darker side of this stuff and the power games that go with it. So it's not. I'm sure someone could come on your podcast who's used this stuff to help people and improve lives and so on. But that's kind of not what I'm writing about.
Yeah, well, indeed, I have. I mean, the premise of my course was that we now had the tools to create a new kind of Taylorism, right? Where you could measure at a microscopic level all of the activity in your workforce, even if your workforce was, producing software instead of, right, producing cars or widgets.
Mm.
And if you could really understand what motivation was and what got people interested in working and being productive, then you could provide the employees with the appropriate incentives
Mm.
to maximize their productivity. And you're absolutely right. On the one hand, it could be like, well, isn't this fantastic? Everybody wants to be more productive because then they can get paid more. But on the other hand, it means that there's an opportunity for the micromanagement
Mm.
of people's feelings. And
Yeah, I mean,
and I think,
there's a privacy issue there, but there's also and a surveillance issue. I think there's also, I mean, if you look at the history of management theory, there's actually a good paper on this, and it's called I can't remember the name of it now, so not very helpful. But which argues that the management theory goes through these waves of rationalism and irrationalism as sort of backlashes. So you have a massive wave of kind of rational exuberance, rationalist exuberance with Taylor and early behaviorism from sort of 1890s through to the kind of 1920s, and then you get this kind of pushback with kind of Elton Mayo and the human relations approach, where everything is much more kind of touchy feely in a way, which is like everything's about relationships and feelings and emotions and so on. You then get this kind of another wave of behaviorism and trust in statistics in the 1960s, where you've got, B.F. Skinner as a psychologist, but you've also got, the kind of stuff that, like Robert McNamara trying to win the Vietnam War using techniques that he'd learned as a manager at Ford of kind of just, of sort of Taylorist kind of statistical analysis. And this great enthusiasm for the predictability of all human action. And then the pushback is a kind of one more stemming from the work of someone like Schumpeter in the 19 sort of 70s, 80s, 90s kind of time, which coincides with what sociologists would call post-Fordism, which is much more attention to sort of, where brands and creativity and flexibility become the kind of watchwords of management and capitalism, where everything's about, you've got to sometimes just do irrational things. Otherwise, you're never going to discover anything. You're never going to have any value creation. You've got to lead with your heart sometimes. And I think you could say that the birth of what some people have called big data, platform capitalism, surveillance capitalism, whatever you want to call it, the Silicon Valley business model that for some, Shoshana Zuboff's sort of traces to the kind of what Google makes this breakthrough in about 2005, where they begins to analyze what Zuboff calls digital exhaust, which is all the sort of data we leave behind us in our trail. That creates a whole new wave of this idea that maybe this time we really can render all human behavior perfectly kind of transparent and predictable. And you also, of course, you get the quantified self movement at the same time. And I mean, I jog, and I want to know how many how fast I've got. I'm not like being some kind of pious. I'm not being judgmental here. I mean, we're all we all care about our ratings and our quantities and all that kind of stuff. So, but yeah, I think we're living through a sort of what you could say a third wave of this kind of hubris around numbers.
Yeah, I mean, even in the business schools, there's always a debate between the economists and the organizational behavior folks as to what matters. And the economists emphasize, incentives and rules, and the organizational behavior people emphasize intrinsic motivation and the touchy-feely stuff. But now, I mean, the promise is that since we can kind of measure everything, that this divide is a false one, right? And it's really a question of, okay, we've got all these different levers, and we can figure out, which levers to press and which levers to push, and these things should not be seen as sort of separate disciplines. I mean, that's the idea. And I think you say that, I mean, this idea of measuring, you talk about two folks back in the day, Petty and Grant, right? And I knew about Petty, I didn't really know that Grant was someone who was a founder of demography.
Mm,
But you use them as examples because they're both people who are very, optimistic and
mm.
humanistic, and were really focused on the promise of data and measurement. But they both basically came up with things which ultimately could be used as instruments of control, right?
Yeah, I mean, Graunt's work, he used these bills of mortality that, I mean, effectively, in London, there began to be this collection of these of data about deaths. I mean, a lot of the history of statistics, um, both modern statistics, but also, sort of pre-modern statistics, but a lot of the development of modern statistics is around birth and death. This is kind of like central questions around sort of what is the population, and what's it doing. And Graunt began to use the fact that there was already these bills of mortality, which were basically trying to create some vaguely standardized data. We're talking about 1680s, that kind of time. Um, and they would include things like causes of death and that kind of thing. And it was an attempt to try to sort of begin to study population in the same way that there'd been these breakthroughs in terms of understanding things like the circulation of blood and in physiology. There'd obviously, the sort of the iconic example of what a mathematical worldview could do was in astronomy and the understanding of planetary movements and the predictability of the heavens. And in a way, you see there's a sort of process over the course of kind of over 100 years of efforts to try to bring a kind of similar rationalism to aspects of everyday affairs in ways that might ultimately benefit rulers. And those, I mean, Graunt himself was partly trying to just impress, his peers at the time. I mean, he presented some of this work at the Royal Society that was at the time a brand new. I mean, it was, I sometimes think of it as a bit like, these sort of um I've never actually sort of visited these sorts of things, but my idea of sort of Silicon Valley kind of freelance, just Silicon Valley sort of founders clubs where they sort of like showing off their ideas
Mm.
to angels and this sort of sort of getting together in these kind of networking associations. The Royal Society was again this sort of nerds gathering to show off their experiments and their sort of their methodological innovations, and Graunt was one of these kind of people. But yeah, I mean, I think the question, and this then turns into these sorts of experiments, the work of Petty, which becomes political economy, really, of trying to apply a quantitative lens to things like the movement of grain across borders and this sort of thing. So then you get um, the early examples of political economists in France over the 18th century, and then Adam Smith is the kind of moment that economists see as being the sort of origin of what they now do in the 1770s. But yeah, I mean, I find all that stuff really really fascinating because it sort of partly reminds you as a reader, there's nothing kind of inevitable or natural about doing social science in a certain way. And normally people are trying to solve some particular kind of problem, and they're doing it in a fairly sort of messy way, fairly clumsy way. And it's only later that these disciplines sort of often build up a kind of a very sort of robust account of themselves. And but in their origins, they're rather sort of eccentric in some ways.
Well, I mean, the promise of the Royal Society was that there could be facts that would be
Yeah.
established. There could be debates about the implications or how to make sense of those facts, but there was this notion that there are facts. But at the end of the day, it's built on trust,
Yeah.
because when someone reports the results of an experiment, right, one has to essentially, if you weren't there,
Mhm.
believe that that person is acting in good faith. And I think for the fairly long period of time after the founding of the Royal Society, most educated people would essentially trust that those facts were reported correctly. And you point out that now, right, very most people don't trust experts, and it's kind of puzzling, right?
Yeah,
Why
I mean, I
don't
think the thing is that so if you go the whole way back to origins of the Royal Society in the late 17th century, I mean, most people had not heard of them. I mean, most people, we're talking about across the population, obviously, most people were illiterate and they didn't have any need for facts. They needed to know sort of, how to kind of do whatever labor they were doing and to feed their families and that kind of thing. I think that the facts that when we talk about a fact, and I'm very indebted to Mary Poovy's work in her book, The History of the Modern Fact, for a lot of this. But when for Poovy, what is a fact? A fact is a kind of a form of representation of whether it be of society or of nature, that seems, in her words, somehow kind of non-interpretive. So it's not a point of view. It's not that this is my belief. It's not something that is dependent on how I tell it. It's something that is almost like a kind of unit of currency that can be moved around. So that if I hand it over to, say, a policeman, and the policeman then takes it to court, and then the court kind of announces it and it gets reported in the newspaper, this thing is somehow unchanged. It has a kind of a mobile capacity. So when we talk about a fact like that the economy grew by 1% in the last quarter, or a fact which obviously there were some facts which are difficult to establish, particularly when there's like a crime and there are sort of conflicting sort of witness statements and this sort of thing. But ultimately, what investigators try to do is to get to these things that they call the facts, and then hopefully those can become established in various ways. Now, through most of the history of the modern fact, in Poovy's terms, the only people who needed these things actually were people who worked in commerce. So if you look at the early newspapers, certainly in the UK, a newspaper like the Times in the 18th century, it reported things like shipping information, and it was information.
Price data.
What's that?
Like price
data, exactly. And you look at the early, obviously some of these journals and newspapers over the 19th century became slightly more kind of campaigning on liberal politics, like The Economist and these sorts of magazines, the Financial Times. They had to also be arguing against protectionism and in favor of free trade and that kind of thing. But their function was to coordinate a relatively small bourgeois community of people who needed to have reliable information about the time and place that things were happening, and when had this ship gone down, and who was going to get a payout from this insurance market, and these sorts of things. And it's not really until the 20th century, with mass literacy and the beginning of kind of broadcast media, that you actually get this idea that you might have an entire kind of public involved in the kind of the consumption, for want of a better word, of facts. And I don't think there's probably ever been a sort of a golden age necessarily for where everybody believed all the same things about everything. But nevertheless, you could say that, in the days when what is now legacy media, which is kind of like analog broadcast media, when there was still a monopoly of the circulation of information, that I'm sure there were people there's always been conspiracy theories, and there's always been kind of like alternative views of the world. But in order to circulate those, you needed to either become a very dedicated kind of pamphleteer, or be very like a photocopier or something like that, or just stand on a street corner raving. And those people have always existed. But clearly, what's happened with the media since, particularly with social media. But I mean, I think the US. I mean, it's not my country, so I'm not going to wade in too much into, there's a lot to say. But, I mean, Fox News has performed a particular role in challenging kind of what are perceived to be sort of mainstream professional narratives around certain issues. And I think that, we now, obviously, the capacity that social media in particular gives to allow people to say, I can identify as someone who is suspicious of facts. I can identify as someone who doesn't take facts at face value, and I actually want to question them. And that's because there's a lot wrong with the world, and therefore I'm not going to. And of course there are certain kinds of facts which most of us never actually get to verify for ourselves, and that would include the facts of, say, climate science, and that these are very, very difficult things to bring into the public sphere, because it's very difficult to prove that why these facts are considered to be facts, and that then allows the kind of politics of populism, or what you want to call it, where it becomes possible for I mean, conspiracy theories, particularly based around, like claims about vaccines and climate and these sorts of things, it's very difficult to, these then become kind of democratic debates. So this is clearly where things have got to. I mean, I think the United States with its being a political system that for which democracy and the public and pluralism of opinion has been so kind of fundamental for so long, has got a quite a distinctive history in all of this respect. I think in a way that I think Europe I think is behind in terms of this sort of fracturing of a kind of facts, but by no means unaffected by it. I think the one thing I would say is if you look at the surveys on trust, um, it tends to be that trust in scientists themselves, even in the United States, is not. It's that's not really the problem. The trust is the trust problem is entirely to do with trust in politicians and with journalists. And trust in politicians and journalists has been kind of like, it's been falling for decades and it's now extremely low. And the problem is, how do you sustain? You could, you might be able to take your regular sort of, um, Fox News watching, whatever, Trump voting person who, believes a lot of the things that, whatever, Robert Kennedy is saying about vaccines and so on. But you could take them to an actual scientific meeting, and they might have a fair amount of confidence in what they witness, and it may be possible for them to actually, if they would go to the equivalent of the Royal Society. The problem is that people's access to information is being channeled via media and institutions that they have completely lost any trust in. This is the problem. This is a kind of a political collapse of legitimacy, and I think particularly the fact that Trump could stand up at. I remember seeing it in 2016, and in particular where he would say, he would call CNN the Clinton media, and that this idea that there is that as soon as anybody attempts any form of what in the past was considered to be sort of professional reporting, that is already a partial position. This is a kind of symptom of a political crisis as much as anything else.
Yeah, so it's not just the politicians that people have lost faith in, but it's also the technocrats, right?
Yeah.
The so-called deep state, right? Those folks, the media, university professors, and so forth. But is it because there is a loss of faith across the board, or is it just that we have something that looks a little bit more like direct democracy, and so we're seeing, it's much more visible what the general sentiment is, whereas that might have been sort of sidelined because the elites more or less controlled the political process.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
I think you're right when you say direct democracy. I think there is a sort of I think the internet and digital media, generally produces a kind of mirage of immediacy.
Mhm.
There's a book by Anna Kornbler on the idea of immediacy in as a kind of like as a sort of an aesthetic um, dimension of all across all sorts of different areas of culture and politics and the economy. That there's this idea that it's like the phrase "do your own research," and I think like there was a lot of that going on during COVID, obviously, but as people's lives become more based around screens and digital interfaces, there's this idea that they feel suspicious of and patronized by sort of intermediary institutions of various kinds, and that I think is the sort of and that's an very easy thing for demagogues to manipulate, because it's a kind of it's a false immediacy. Ultimately, it's just a different form of kind of dependency, really. But so I think it's very difficult that we all of the different links in the chain between.
Mhm.
I mean, the Royal Society was a small private members club. I mean, they didn't really have much of a. I mean, another really interesting kind of thing that I took from Pubi's book actually on this was, some of the bodies that they had to try and to share their facts with early on were other scientific societies, kind of in Florence or somewhere like that from London, and the people who they got to kind of carry their scientific papers from one city to another were merchants, because in a way they saw merchants as being their kind of kindred spirits in a way, because they were also people with a certain kind of Protestant disposition of objectivity and not to kind of they were dispassionate and they respected paper and they knew how to look after paper and that kind of stuff. And but the problem now is that there are just all these different links in the chain between where the kind of fact originates from and it's sort of, the kind of end user. And the end user has sort of, got something that seems far more kind of authentic and feels far more kind of alive than something that has been sort of channeled to them via whatever the IPCC or the, something like that.
Well, what I found interesting is you suggested that our political system, our politics is now like a system one politics as opposed to, system two. The scientific method is something that is obviously system two. It's slower, it's more
Yeah.
deliberative, and that's sort of its strength. That's why we can trust the results. It typically takes some time, and there's lots of checks and balances and so forth. But nowadays, with the immediacy of information and the speed with which we can access stuff, we're now sort of making decisions based on system one, and the political
Yeah.
system. There's a lot of frustration. I mean, that's the big complaint about Washington, is that it's slow. Everything takes forever, what people are clamoring for are politicians who
Mm.
will sort of steamroll or override all of those checks and balances and all that deliberation, which seems to be getting in the way of responding to real problems.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that the um, appeal of a kind of political strongman is similar, has a similar, in a way, on a kind of, I don't want to I don't want to like make this too literal sounding, but there's a kind of analog going on between that appeal and the appeal of, say, Uber as an app, which is like, I want it here and I want it now kind of thing. And there's a sort of similar, I mean, for, as I say, following from afar, and I don't want to, I'm cautious of sort of trying to like theorize societies from a distance where others are much closer to them. But you like a lot of what Trump's rhetoric is about. I'm not going to wait. I'm not going to delay. I'm going to fix this now. I'm going to fix it. And of course, he doesn't. Like it's clear from the previous presidency that a lot of stuff just went kind of just neglected and wasn't finished and didn't even get started. But I think there is a certain hunger and an expectation that things get done.
Mhm.
Get done very quickly. I think that it's really difficult, and I think obviously that in a way someone like Elon Musk is the kind of link man between those two kind of um applications of the sort of of that sort of political impatience, because part of the what these sorts of entrepreneurs offer is that they don't ask for permission. They don't sit around waiting for the rules to be changed. They just get on and do it. Move fast and break things, as the original Facebook motto. But and I think I mean, we've got a new government in the UK. Centre progressive liberal government. For a while was kind of really kept picking up aspects of Biden administration ideas and saying, this is where things are heading now. This is the future, and we're going to do what Biden's been doing. And they're not going to be saying that so much anymore. But I think that certainly one of the things that they are also kind of, I think, very frustrated by in the UK is, I think there is a sense that the state has become too slow in some way. So you look at like industrial policy, which is the kind of vogue that the Biden administration really kind of made the rest of the world, or certainly made Europe, wake up and think, okay, we've got to start doing some of this stuff now. We've got to start launching our own technologies and energy infrastructures and that kind of stuff. One of the I think one of the reactions to all of that in the policymaking establishment is, well, the problem is that the regulations are so sort of rigid in lots of areas, that it's really, you always get left behind. And that, there's also, I think, a sense, we're now competing against effectively a form of sort of authoritarian state capitalism on a global scale in China, where people don't need to ask for permission. They can go and build vast cities in the space of a few years without having to kind of consult everybody first. And there's a sort of I think there's a sense that is certainly in Europe, is the sort of liberal social democratic traditions of Europe, are they sort of holding back European capitalism? That, I think, is an idea that people actually that's not just a sort of libertarian Musk type idea. I think it's something that I think increasingly people, there's a guy who is sort of sympathetic to a lot of the kind of Musk worldview, who was instrumental in the pro Brexit campaign, called Dominic Cummings in the UK, and he was briefly working in the government with Boris Johnson, but he was a real advocate for basically, people saying that actually the civil service is about sort of 5 times bigger than it needs to be, this kind of thing, and Steve Bannon was saying this stuff for different reasons under Trump. And the new leader of the Conservative Party in the UK, Kemi Badenoch, she made some joke, which again sounds like something you'd hear at sort of an American conservative convention. She probably where she heard it, but she said, she said something like 5% of civil servants in this country should actually be in prison. And she probably got a laugh from the audience, because no one actually thinks she's going to start locking up civil servants. But there's a sort of like mixture of sort of fascistic and kind of entrepreneurial and kind of solutionist Silicon Valley kind of approach to things. You could say that actually, the climate crisis also invites some of that as well. So there are different sort of, it's not just the sort of right or the far right that is kind of feeling some of these things.
Well, look, I mean, when the world is changing rapidly, you need to be able to act rapidly.
Yeah.
And I think most people would agree with that. But the problem, as you point out, is that if people are using system one, right, then they're really going to be in a perpetual state of fight or flight. And that sort of gets at your book in Nervous States, but also talks in the book Happiness, because it is kind of puzzling as to why there is this underlying sense of unease and anxiousness and stress and unhappiness when, according to all of the objective indicators, right, we have been experiencing prosperity that is, unprecedented in human history.
Yeah. Well, I think, I think that, I think that there are, go back to what we were saying earlier about, economics and psychology learning from each other. There are interesting, I think there are interesting things that we can learn from psychology about why, what makes us unhappy. I think one of the things that a lot of political psychology and economic psychology demonstrates quite convincingly, and I think that that this is something that social media platforms weaponize, is that when we, comparing ourselves to others is actually makes us far more unhappy than economics. The history of economics back to Adam Smith has always assumed there's this thing called value, and it works in aggregates. And I talk a lot about Jeremy Bentham in my book, The Happiness Index, as well, who would say that utility is value, and it moves up, it moves in aggregate. So it's like GDP is a kind of an aggregate, and even if it's only risen a little bit, it's risen a bit, so we should be happier than we were last year because it's risen a tiny bit. And of course, that's not when people are. Obviously, some people are getting worse off, that's an issue to do with inequality. But one of the things that social media enables, and it's always said that one of the reasons that Peter Thiel was such an enthusiastic early investor in Facebook was that because he was a very pessimistic follower of the philosopher René Girard, who believed that the central motivation for human psychology was what Girard called mimetic desire, which is that what I most want is the thing that you want. So it's like kids, it's like they all like. Do you have Air Up bottles in the States? Like all of the kids, Air Up is this ridiculous product that basically is it's a way in which suddenly every kid wants a water bottle that costs £35 rather than £5 because all the other ones have got
I think I think we have a different name for it.
Right. Okay. It makes the water taste flavored, even though it's actually playing a trick on your brain through this thing that smells. Anyway, but it's a genius piece of marketing because it basically taps into the fact that kids are seeing this thing in school and they're all going to come home and say, I want it because everybody else is wanting it. And it's and this is what social media is doing, because it allows us to all observe one another. Instagram and Facebook incentivize this kind of sharing of your most sort of positive photos, and then sort of feeling kind of terrible that everyone else seems to be having a better time than you. And I think this is also the logic of of populism in democracy. I mean, one of the most consistent findings in political psychology regarding voting behavior when it comes to what we might generally call populist party or populist movements, and this applies in Europe and in the United States, is that the people who are most persuaded by figures like Trump, but it might equally be Meloni or Le Pen or the Brexit movement and so on in the UK, are people who are suffering feelings of relative decline. So that doesn't mean that they are becoming worse off. In fact, they may actually be doing quite well, but they're feeling that others are either kind of catching up with them. So the gap which they would, and this has kind of racial dimensions to it, but the gap that they historically imagined between them and those beneath them is shrinking, but also the gap that they see between themselves and those above them is widening. And so that actually the benchmarks that people use, and this is something that I think behavioral economics has proved fairly convincingly, is that the benchmarks people use are relative, are social benchmarks, that they are relative to others. And this flatly contradicts in some ways the sort of central tenet of economics back to Adam Smith, which is that aggregates of welfare or value or whatever, utility or whatever you want to call it, kind of have their own sort of logic. And that if I get paid 10% more next year, then I should become somehow sort of 10% happier in some ways, but not if other people are all getting paid 20% more. So this is and I think we can all relate to that, but I think it's a very, very potent political emotion.
Yeah, and another part of the books focuses on psychosomatic illness, which I think is, the term sounds somewhat pejorative, but I think it actually is a fairly accurate description of a huge phenomenon, right? Which is when you look at the life expectancy of Americans sort of plateauing, and you look at the physical and mental health of Americans plateauing, and you look at, the pain epidemic. I mean, this is, I think it's impossible to explain this in ways, the traditional ways, like access to healthcare. I mean, it clearly must have some sociological causes, right?
Sure, and I mean, the work of Anne Case and Angus Deaton on these deaths of despair, as they're known, in particularly, and these are the sudden spike in mortality rates amongst non-college graduate white males in particular, which is unprecedented. It's not the only other case of this kind of thing in an industrial society is what happened in the collapsing Soviet Union in the early 1990s, which was heavily linked to alcoholism, and as is the deaths of despair that Case and Deaton find in the United States, that it's connected to, well, not alcoholism, but particularly sort of alcoholism and opiates, but also the other forms of suicide and also, I mean, something which I talk a bit about is famous studies in the UK showing that heart disease, which is a massive contributor to premature death, is linked to loss of social status to a great extent. There's something kind of stressful and depressing about losing social status, that one, the feelings that go with that. So I find this stuff interesting because I think it's interesting politically and sociologically. I think that it probes. I've always been quite interested in the boundaries between different social sciences, because in a way what all of this stuff does is to demonstrate that problems of inequality, problems of status, of self-respect and participation in one's social life, the ability to have some influence over one's life, which I think is so important. These things kind of permeate areas that were once seen as separate problems of medicine and separate and of physiology. And I think that increasingly that we see these different these different crises kind of bleeding into each other in different ways. And I think that's right. That I think that a loss of hope and a loss of a sense of purpose does have all of these quite profound health effects. I mean, but you could also, I'm as you can tell, I'm someone who I quite like straying into other disciplines and sort of picking up what I can learn from them. And often you find these resonances. But there's, I mean, evolutionary psychology is in some ways a rather sort of, I mean, certainly sociologists are rather suspicious of it because it all sounds a little bit kind of Darwinian and a little bit kind of like everything's reduced to back to sort of genetics and so on. But I think people there are similar studies of animal communities in which the loss of status in a chimp community or something like that has all sorts of has an effect on measurable physical well-being. So actually status is something that we kind of need biologically as well as politically.
Yeah, in my behavioral finance class, I spent a lot of time talking about animals.
Right.
Even though they don't buy and sell stocks. But Hobbes plays a huge role in your book as sort of the founder of modernity, or sort of a co-founder of modernity. And of course, he, along with the Royal Society, believed that feelings had no place in scientific inquiry or in the establishment of truth. Do you think that normative principle of sidelining feelings sort of bled into their positive understanding of the world and led them to sort of ignore the impact of feelings and the reality of feelings?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the project of modernity, and it's quite I mean, as many critics, particularly those working within post-colonial studies and feminism, have drawn a lot of attention to the fact that this is a project of rationalism that has hoarded the privileges of rationalism for particular kinds of populations, particularly kind of the colonizing white male who sees other populations as sentimental, herd-like, irrational, somatic, overly emotional, and therefore in need of some kind of mathematically derived form of order. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. That the kind of bracketing of certain things as emotional and as sentimental and as bodily has gone hand in hand with the elevation of certain kinds of projects and of certain kinds of agents over others and certain kinds of hierarchies. I mean, Hobbes was had a vision of human psychology, but it was a very pessimistic one because it was focused primarily on fear and aggression, and saw that these were the dominant emotions that would govern in the absence of a rationally designed state. And I think that liberalism is. Hobbes is often seen as being the founder of liberal political theory. Although nothing, if you read Hobbes, you don't find someone who sounds much like a liberal. There's no space for human rights or free speech or anything like that. There's not much of that. There's a lot of power, centralized power and authority. But the reason he's seen as a liberal is that he believes that the project of politics needs to start with a rationally conceived, elitist project of establishing a state along the right lines with the right rules, and from there on, all sorts of other good things might follow. But you have to start there, and it's not democratic in the slightest. Now, liberalism, I think, has always suffered with that. You could see that part of the difficulty. I mean, I can talk about the problem in my own country, that you look at the total the difficulty of campaigning to remain in the European Union. I mean, the European Union is a liberal project in the utterly kind of Hobbesian tradition, and no one knew how to make a case for that democratically. No one knew what kinds of interests, so they knew what interests to appeal to, because interest is a liberal concept. The interest was GDP growth is going to be higher if we remain in. You're more likely to kind of keep your job, all this kind of stuff. But they had no emotions that they could speak to whatsoever. They just didn't know where to start, and they got beaten again unexpectedly. And that's why it was 4 months later that Hillary Clinton got beaten in a fairly similar way. Again, in defiance of everything that everybody was expecting, and so on. So there's that. I think that Hobbes sets Western political theory off on a particular path that I think liberalism has struggled to get off. I mean, there are particular liberal political thinkers who have tried to sort of widen its lens, and people like Martha Nussbaum and others have sort of tried to kind of engage with the politics of, I mean, very very brilliantly and successfully in lots of ways. But it definitely is there is definitely a sort of a privileging of rationality that occasionally invites these sorts of popular responses.
Well, if we think about the loss of trust in these elites that we're experiencing today, I mean, to what extent is that the fault of the elites themselves? I mean, it seems like the elites, we're very good at finding faults with our predecessors and pointing to the elites of the 18th and 19th century and saying, look at these folks, slave owners and whatever. But when it comes to, looking at the faults that we have today, I mean, COVID-19, I mean, this book that you wrote, Nervous States, was before the COVID epidemic. And it seems like, that was an instance where the elites, they just exacerbated this loss of trust.
Yeah, I mean, I think
the
there's been a succession of moments where the elites said they knew what they were doing, and then they turned out not to. I think in the UK, I don't know if this would in the UK. I think the biggest one in the last 40 years was over the Iraq War, actually, where Tony Blair. I mean, in some ways, it was simpler for Bush and the neoconservatives, because they kind of wanted to take Saddam Hussein down, regardless of what they found when they got there, kind of thing. Blair said he made this promise, and he was like a sort of God-fearing kind of center-left liberal. And he said, we know he's got weapons of mass destruction. That's why we're doing this. And that was what the entire thing hung on. And I think after that turned out not to be the case, I think that was a huge moment in a lot of people thinking that democracy was a sham, and that these people are liars, and that they're lying on purpose. And then you have the global financial crisis, which is 5 years later, where it's a very, very difficult thing to understand, but that had a major effect. The aftermath of that had a major effect on things like the formation of the Tea Party in the United States, where part of the macroeconomic response to apart from the fact that the global financial crisis involved basically taxpayers bailing out the people who were already extremely rich to hundreds of billions of dollars. You then had this, the phase of quantitative easing, which was absolutely ripe for conspiracy theory, and it's very, very difficult to understand, but ripe for something like the Tea Party movement to come along and say, "Oh, we can tell you what's actually going on here. It's actually quite simple."
You mean Occupy Wall Street?
Occupy Wall Street. Well, they did it as well. They did, but they didn't. They didn't then turn that into a set of. Well, maybe I'm revealing my political preferences too much, but they didn't turn it into the basis of an entire conspiracy theory. That the problem with finance, of course, is that some of those are conspiracies, and it's kind of a problem of trying to disentangle the ones which do exist from the ones that from the ones that are kind of that are sort of fantasies. But Occupy Wall Street, of course, yes, it did attempt to initiate a kind of left populist response, which you could then say that something like the Sanders movement kind of pick that up. But yeah, you've got these other you've got these moments. I mean, I think the other interesting thing about which I've written a bit about, this is in my book you mentioned earlier, This Is Not Normal, which is a series of essays about the UK. But one of the really interesting things about the decade following the global financial crisis is the new way in which transparency operated. So, I mean, there's long been an interest in transparency through, say, audit culture. So, companies get audited, their books get shared so that shareholders can see it. Effectively, that there's the way in which you see inside an organization is partly through these procedures of certain professionals who reporters go in, investigative journalists go in, and they come out with things. Auditors go in, accountants. These are kind of, again, other versions of sort of facts that get kind of brought to light, and people go, okay, that one, we can now see that this institution is valid. What happened in the decade of the global financial crisis was a series of mega leaks. And these are things that are kind of outside of anyone's control. So you have things like, well, there was WikiLeaks, obviously, but there was also things like the Edward Snowden revelations, which again was a kind of a mass leak of someone who is an insider who brings to light something that has basically been kept a secret. And these people often end up, can end up kind of on the run, as Snowden did. But we also, in the UK, we had this thing called the MP's expenses scandal in, I think it was 2011, where effectively every member of parliament, so these are like congressmen, is allowed to claim expenses for the running of their offices. And suddenly there was this massive, well, actually it used freedom of information request, but that law was relatively new at the time, a huge kind of data sweep of everything that these people had actually been doing. And some of this kind of awful stuff came out that basically they were lying about, how many houses they had. And someone was claiming money to have his duck pond cleaned. And someone was claiming money to, download porn at home on his TV. And I mean, all this stuff came out, and it did and quite understandably, it did incredible damage to the reputation of political representatives. But we had others as well. We had the the hacking scandal, where it turned out, which massively discredited the Murdoch press, where it turned out that all sorts of, not just celebrities, but the family of a dead child were having their phones hacked by a Murdoch newspaper in order to tell stories. So this sense that actually the front stage and the backstage is actually completely different. The front stage is basically phony. It's trying to dupe you, and every now and then there's a crack, and the truth comes kind of rushing out in this very dramatic, very shocking way. That's a very different culture of transparency from, say, the auditors have gone into your company and they've confirmed that your accounts are correct. And I think that in a way is a feature and a consequence of living in a mass surveillance society, because it means that basically public life can go on in all the ways that it does through press conferences and reports and newspapers and so on. But there's also the possibility at any moment that what's going on outside of the public eye can suddenly be kind of, it's like a sort of volcano kind of erupts and the truth comes out. And so culture of mass surveillance goes hand in hand with a mentality of conspiracy theory, because a conspiracy theorist believes, in some ways quite correctly, that there's all this other stuff going on. You just don't yet know about it, but someone else knows about it. And they're right. And that, in a way, has always been a feature of social life. There's always been more to political institutions than meets the eye. But what there wasn't in the past was this capacity for vast quantities of data to suddenly come spewing out and often discrediting quite famous and quite powerful people.
Right. I mean, it's clearly not the case that politicians are more corrupt or dishonest than they were in the past,
No.
right? I mean,
no, they're probably less so, actually. I mean, in some way,
but we now have sort of immediate visibility into some of these breaches.
Yeah, and also a great authority and charisma to someone who's willing to kind of call it out. And the paradox, of course, is that often the people who get given that task of calling it out and get given a lot of kudos for doing so are also, maybe even more corrupt. And I mean, this is the sort of frustration that figures like Trump pose to their critics. Of their liberal critics, is to say, but you did this with your taxes, and you did this, and you're a felon, and all this sort of stuff. And and we had a version of this for a while with Boris Johnson. And I think that there's a sense that, well, yeah, I mean, the whole system's cooked, and we need to have someone who's capable of naming that.
Well, I mean, if we look at the academia and the media and the public health officials and so forth, I mean, do you think that the loss of faith in their authority is primarily driven by their adherence to the principles laid out by the Royal Society and Hobbes, or is it because they've sort of lost sight of them? I mean, some people would argue, like
Well,
Jonathan Roach,
I think
that they
yeah.
failed to live up to it, right?
Yeah.
That they let themselves get sloppy But others would say, no, it's actually, this was inevitable if you pursue this approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly, people feel that they don't the monopoly gets broken by some of these elite community. The monopoly, these elite communities often depend on having a monopoly over a certain aspect of social public economic life, which incidentally is one of the reasons why populism and radical free market sort of libertarianism work so well together, because in a way the critique of monopolies can be both one which says, well, we need to privatize more things and we need to allow the market to do more things, and that way we won't be reliant on these people who've gained this kind of monopolistic control. So universities would be a kind of classic example of this, which is like, we don't need to. We're no longer reliant on universities for educational research any longer, because we've got all of this other amazing, these other resources, and that's true. I mean, ultimately, it's not. It's hard to argue with that. And from there, you can get to the point where it's like, well, why do these people think they're so damn important in the first place? Well, it's because they're all hanging out together with going to each other's dinner parties, and they've all kind of inflated their reputations in each other's eyes, and it's about time they got brought down a peg or two, kind of thing. And that's quite a powerful message that works around the certain eras of kind of populist media and right wing campaigns. I think. I do think that there are cases where, to go back to what I was saying earlier, where certain forms of elite expertise have become completely kind of divorced from reality in certain respects, and the economics profession has been the focus of that critique at various times. I think the way in which science and expertise gets communicated politically is a really difficult area. I mean, I don't have the answer here. There are whole people who work. There's a whole area of science policy and science studies which thinks entirely about messaging and so on. And it's always been quite a big concern in the United States, where how do you marry a kind of administrative state to a political culture that privileges the town square kind of thing. How do these two things kind of live side by side? And it's really difficult, and I think that I'm sure there's still more that could be learned. I mean, climate scientists think a lot about or areas of sort of climate campaigning think a lot about communication and messaging and so on. But it's I don't know. It's I think everyone has to ask themselves questions about where they could have done better.
Well, I wish we had time to talk more about what you see happening in this, wellness movement, which has only gotten stronger since you
Yeah.
wrote this book 10 years ago. But one of the questions that I often get when I teach this material is, it's fantastic that companies are interested and countries are interested in, their subjective well-being of their citizens and their employees. But the techniques they're using, some would say, is just sort of like a salve. It's like, okay, we stress the crap out of you, we make your life miserable, and then we give you a yoga class to kind of
Yeah.
lighten things up. Maybe we should focus on making it less stressful to begin with. I mean, to what extent is this sort of a band-aid for the
Well, that's
problems that
sort of the
they're
argument of my book, The Happiness Industry, what you've just outlined there. I mean, that's kind of where I sort of end up. And one of the things I try to do in that book is to draw together some examples of how people have tried to think a little bit about, because you can't be against well-being. You can't want people to become unhealthy or to become unhappy or anything, although you can at least recognize that unhappiness is a healthy part of a sort of fully rounded existence. But I think so. For example, I talk in the book a bit about the occupational health movement of the 1960s, which did try to think a bit about the way in which status and power is distributed within organizations, so as to grant people the dignity will then not lead them to become stressed and depressed. Or you can think a bit about to what extent is the welfare state, to the extent that any of us have one of those, is it actually kind of building people's autonomy and self-respect, or is it just kind of forcing people to go through kind of coaching sessions in order to sort of tick a box and then, have your sort of like, your mentality kind of worked on. So I think that recognizing that people have reasons for why they feel as they do, and that they may not be brilliant they may not be able to articulate them perfectly, but that that their understanding of their own situation and their own narrative about it is something that needs to be understood in explaining feelings and happiness and unhappiness. This is a sort of starting point for a different kind of politics of well-being, potentially one that points in more democratic, less sort of behaviorist, less manipulative ways. And I think, I think there are some useful insights that can be gleaned from some of this kind of comparative data that is on different national, well-being indicators. I mean, it's fairly kind of it's fairly clunky kind of data, this stuff, but it's generally clear that societies which they're interesting studies, societies that the things that this science of happiness proves, not that surprisingly, that actually spending time doing things that we consider to be intrinsically worthwhile, like hanging out with our families, or pursuing activities in the outdoors that we enjoy doing, is more likely to make us happy than simply kind of working more and consuming more. I mean, this is not a mystery. This is not something. I mean, most people intuitively understand this, but that would then point towards a set of policy goals regarding kind of work-life balance and the rights to log off, and the right to not always be kind of like kind of at the beck and call of your manager and that kind of thing. So those are kind of more about sort of empowering people than just sort of fixing them the whole time.
But the idea is that the happiness industry, like the medical industry, should focus on underlying causes and not simply be in the business of symptom alleviation.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. Well, thanks for joining me. This is great. Nervous States, Happiness Industry, and I will be sure to check out your book on England, which I did not get a chance to read.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, talk later.
Great. Thanks very much.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.